The origins of the Etruscans is a little understood portion of their history, with many historians outright disliking the conjecture in favor of what the Etruscans actually did. With that being said, I believe it is an important and interesting topic, as it not only tells us about the Etruscans, but also gives us insight into the Greeks and Romans. There are three main theories from our ancient sources: that of Herodotus and their eastern origin, Livy and Pliny the Elder's northern origin, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus' Autochthonius theory. Each one has its flaws, but which one is most likely? Herodotus' story has the most egregious fabrications and can be outright rejected, so I would like to begin with his. He asserts that the origins of the Etruscans, known to the Greeks as the Tyrrhenians, can be traced back to the 2nd millennium BC in Lydia. Lydia, for many years, was going through a famine when its king Aetus, son of Manes, devised a solution. This solution is as follows. At last, their king divided the people into two groups and made them draw lots, so that the one group should remain and the other leave the country. He himself was to be the head of those who drew the lot to remain there, and his son, whose name was Tyrrhenus, of those departed. Then the one group, having drawn the lot, left the country and came down to Smyrna and built ships, in which they loaded all their goods that could be transported aboard ship, and sailed away to seek livelihood and a country. Until at last, after sojourning with one people after another, they came to the Umbyrci, where they founded cities and have lived there ever since. They no longer called themselves Lydians, but Tyrrhenians, after the name of the king's son who had led them there. This story is one of the most fantastical for the origins of the Etruscans, and as such, many are drawn to it, but there are a multitude of reasons why it can be rejected. First, the Greeks were notorious for fabricating creation stories of various settlements and people. Nearly every city within Greece was founded by a single semi- or fully mythological figure. This was one way the Greeks could build a type of national identity that they could use for justification for the modern Greek actions. One reason that Lydia may have been chosen is because they are historic enemies of the Greeks, and thus a justification for Greco-Etruscan hostilities, which began around the mid-6th century BC. Second, the historian Xanthus of Lydia was a major historian, hailing from the supposed origin and expert on its history. But he himself denies that this event ever happened, and this is seconded by Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Third, the Etruscans and Lydians lacked any significant similarities in their culture that one would expect to find. The only links to each other are that both regions' use of the double pipe flute and dice and had a relative freedom of movement, at least compared with the Greeks. Also important to note is that their languages are nothing alike, a key point as the Etruscan language is extremely unique as it is non-Indo-European. My last point for Herodotus is one of timing. The Lydians hypothetically settled in Etruria around 1250 BC, but no large-scale society in Etruria emerged until around the 8th century BC. That leaves about 500 years completely unaccounted for, much too long for these supposed settlers of an advanced society to develop again. The most probable reason for this Greek fabrication is a false etymological link between the two. Within Lydia is a town called Tirha, which is modern-day Tyre in Izmir, which, because of its similarities with the Greek name for the Etruscans, Tyrrhenians, was enough evidence for the Greeks to draw a connection that eventually grew into the story given by Herodotus. The next theory for the origin of the Etruscans can be found in the Roman historians Livy and Pliny the Elder, who claim the Etruscans came from north of the Alps in a mass migration. Their evidence for this is severely lacking, but modern historians believe that this link was caused because of the supposed similarities between the Etruscans and the Rhaetians, who inhabited further north in Cisalpine Gaul. Both people spoke a non-Indo-European language, which was enough for the Romans to equate the two as outsiders, a pastime that the Romans excelled in. This theory grew in popularity because the Etruscans' history was not written by themselves, but rather by Greek and Roman historians, who sought to downplay Etruscan accomplishments and label them as others. This brings us to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, whose belief was that the Etruscans were an autochthonous people who had essentially always lived in the region. It is a veritable Occam's razor, as it is the simplest out of the three, and many modern historians agree with this. There are, however, still problems with this theory, as Dionysius himself may not be the most reliable narrator. He may have been seeking to do the opposite of Herodotus in refusing to give the Etruscans a Greek-like founding story, further showing them as alien or exotic in the eyes of the Greeks. It also envisions the Etruscans as a static people who acted as a hermit society which then exploded into a Mediterranean power. This contrasts with Etruscan society itself, which was famously opulent and active in trade. This means that an isolated people developed by themselves a culture of trade without immigration which could act as an impetus for cultural shift. Like most things, I believe reality is not a single one of these theories, but rather a combination. While the story of Herodotus can be outright rejected, the northern migration and the Autochthonius theories both have merit. In a previous video, I have talked about the Villanovans, their founding and their culture, but I do not particularly like the term Villanovan, as it implies them as other than the Etruscans. Instead, I prefer to use the term Proto-Etruscan. But because Villanovan is already a term used by modern historians, I chose to use it as well, for consistency's sake. My depiction of the Urnfield culture in the 10th century BC shows them merely coming down and settling in northern Italy. But that is overly simplistic. Mass migration into Etruria is highly unlikely, as proponents like Herodotus and Pliny would have us believe. It was more probable a slow trickle of outsiders slowly bringing their culture to the region and creating a completely unique people than its first inhabitants. This would not stop, however, with the Urnfields and the Apenninic peoples creating Villanovan or Proto-Etruscan, but would continue well into the 8th century BC, with Greeks, Phoenicians, Latins, Sardinians, and Italics all contributing to Etruscan culture. But just as Etruscan culture was influenced, they did the same to their neighbors, most famously in Rome. In these regards, I believe the most probable reality of the Etruscans' origins are a mixture of migration from the north, as well as native inhabitants of the region slowly creating a unique culture. Society and culture is a forever evolving thing, so even to ask the question itself, what are the origins of the Etruscans, is difficult to understand, because what defines somebody as an Etruscan? It is because of questions like these that it is not upsetting to me that we will never have a concrete answer to their origins. Because in merely the conjecture about the topic, one is able to get into the minds of people who had the same questions thousands of years ago. I just think that's neat.